After the Civil War, local officials attempted to remove the plantation's existence from public records due to its unsettling operating method, according to records housed in the Wilkinson County Courthouse. The Jessup family plantation ran what nearby landowners informally referred to as the breeding enterprise for 23 years, from 1835 to 1858. In order to secure wealth for future generations, the plantation owner, his wife, and all 5 of their children engaged in a systematic program of forced reproduction with enslaved individuals. This instance is especially disturbing not only because of what transpired, but also because of how well it was orchestrated, how voluntarily the whole family took part, and how totally the neighborhood chose to ignore it. These were human beings, yet the Jessup ledgers, which were found in a locked trunk in 1962, recorded everything with the icy accuracy of livestock records. Please hit the notification bell and subscribe to our channel before we go on to the tale of the Jessup plantation and how a whole family persuaded themselves that breeding people like cattle was just smart business, so that you never miss such tales. Additionally, kindly let us know which state or city you are viewing from in your comment. Now, to see how this nightmare started, let's travel back in time to Mississippi in 1835. In 1835, Wilkinson County, Mississippi, was a cotton-growing region where harvest brought both prosperity and hardship. The Jessup plantation was located around 8 miles northeast of county seat Woodville. With inherited funds from his father, a tobacco merchant from Virginia who had earned a significant profit supplying Confederate armies during numerous conflicts, Isaiah Jessup had bought the estate in 1829. When Isaiah purchased the farm, he was 31 years old and just married to Ruth Kendish, the daughter of a South Carolina plantation owner. Ruth was 23 years old, from a family that had run a sizable rice farm for 3 generations, and she had her education in Charleston. In addition to growing cotton, the Jessup plantation kept animals, vegetable gardens, and a small orchard. Isaiah had 42 slaves by 1835, which was a small amount in comparison to the biggest plantations in the region, but significant enough to identify him as a wealthy individual. Built in the Greek Revival style, which was fashionable at the time among wealthy Southerners, the plantation home was a 2-story building with white columns. Upstairs, there were 6 bedrooms, a spacious dining area, Isaiah's study, and a salon where Ruth hosted the spouses of other plantation owners. Thomas, Isaiah and Ruth's first child, was born in 1831 after they were married in 1830. Samuel followed in 1833, followed by Margaret in 1835, Daniel in 1837, and Elizabeth in 1839, 5 kids in 8 years. While Isaiah spent his days managing the fields, traveling to Natchez for business, and keeping in touch with cotton buyers and other plantation owners, Ruth ran the household with the assistance of enslaved domestic staff. The Jessups looked like any other wealthy plantation family in the antebellum South to anyone looking on from the outside. Every Sunday they went to worship at the Woodville Presbyterian congregation. Isaiah was a member of the Agriculture Board for the county. Ruth was a member of women's humanitarian organizations. They hired a private tutor to teach their kids. The Jessup children were taught reading, writing, math, and scripture by a man from Kentucky named Charles Whitfield, who resided in a cabin on the grounds. However, behind closed doors at the plantation house, Isaiah and Ruth were having discussions that would have horrified even their neighbors who owned slaves. Isaiah had developed an obsession with a specific issue that many plantation owners faced: the ongoing requirement to buy additional slave labor. The 1830s had seen a steady increase in prices. An adult male field worker in good condition might cost between $800 and $200, which is a substantial outlay of funds. That investment was lost when slaves grew too old to work or passed away from illness or accidents. Isaiah pored over his account books, calculated expenses, and projected future spending for hours in his study. Ruth knew the economics of slavery as well as any man, having watched her father run a sizable plantation as a child. The most lucrative farms, according to her father, were those that could produce their own workforce, which entails promoting procreation among enslaved individuals in order to generate fresh labor without incurring purchase costs. The Kendish plantation had advanced this custom, which was widespread in the South. In order to produce what he thought would be the best breeding couples, Ruth's father had methodically linked enslaved individuals he deemed strong or healthy, occasionally dividing families.
Isaiah intended to take things a step further. but Ruth brought these concepts to her marriage.
When Ruth was expecting Margaret in the winter of 1834, Isaiah made a proposal to his wife that would influence their lives and the lives of everyone on their plantation for the next 20 years. According to his theory, enslaved individuals should actively engage in reproduction rather than just supporting it. He told Ruth that his motivation was entirely economic. Such unions would result in children who were legally enslaved and would inherit the mother's position. But they would also carry Jessup blood, which would increase their strength, health, and worth according to Isaiah. These kids might be sold for high sums or kept to work the plantation. In any case, he said, it would be an investment in our future prosperity. Ruth didn't dismiss the notion right away. She gave it some weeks of thinking. She prayed about it. Later, she told her kids. She looked through the books of accounts. She recalled her father's strategies. Finally, she consented. She did, however, add a condition. Their kids would grow up understanding that this was their responsibility and their way of helping the family succeed. They would all join in when the time came. By working together, the family would maximize output and secure the plantation's prosperity for many generations to come. Despite the terrible consequences, this choice was not motivated by sadism or perversion. Ruth agreed, and they started training their kids for what was expected of them. This was deliberate, planned economic planning disguised as family responsibility. Only Thomas Jessup was when his parents started his schooling. He was 3 years old. The training began early, but he was unable to fully comprehend the consequences of what he was being taught. At the dinner table, Isaiah and Ruth discussed freely the plantation slaves as assets, investments, and breeding stock. They spoke the same words they did when talking about cattle or horses. From his earliest recollections, Thomas was exposed to this language. He grew accustomed to it. Thomas knew what was expected of him when he reached adulthood by the time he was 8 years old in 1839. On one of their excursions about the plantation, his father gave him an explanation. Thomas would contribute to workforce expansion. It was a son's responsibility to help the family succeed. Isaiah presented it as maturity, responsibility, and the sign of a man prepared to assume leadership of the family business. Samuel was educated in the same way. Daniel did the same. Though they received separate instruction, Margaret and Elizabeth, 2 girls, had the same ultimate objective. Ruth told them that the goal of a woman was to have children, and the ultimate goal of a woman was to have children who would increase the wealth of her family. Everything. She instilled in them the belief that enslaved women were inferior to them in every manner, and that using them for domestic purposes was no more respectable than using them to prepare food or clean clothes. They were resources and tools. The kids were raised in seclusion. Outside the family, they didn't have many friends. Charles Whitfield, their tutor, taught them math and reading, but the most influential, their parents, were the ones who taught them. By 1845, Elizabeth was 6, Daniel was 8, Margaret was 10, and Thomas was 14. There was a rigid routine in the home: work during the week, church on Sundays, and meals at the same time every day. Thomas was taught by Isaiah to examine the fields, assess the well-being and output of enslaved laborers, to always consider profit, and to get more active in plantation management. Loss. Since they didn't know anything different, the Jessup kids didn't challenge what they were taught. They lacked an opposing viewpoint and voice. Isaiah's authority was never questioned by their tutor. Upon visiting the property, the Presbyterian preacher observed an affluent and orderly household. Nothing out of the ordinary was observed by other plantation families who interacted with the Jessups. If they did, however, they stated nothing. The antebellum South had a culture that valued privacy, with reference to what took place on a man's land. A plantation owner was in charge of what he did with his slaves. After supper on a muggy May 1848 evening, Thomas, then 17 years old, was summoned into the study by Isaiah. Ruth was seated in the chair in the corner. On the other side of his father's desk was Thomas. Now that Thomas was a man, Isaiah clarified, it was time for him to carry out his responsibilities to the family. A 20-year-old lady called Hannah, who worked in the kitchen, had been chosen. That evening, she would be taken to Thomas's chamber. Thomas didn't say no. Thomas's chamber. Thomas didn't say no. All his life, he had been ready for this moment. It was anticipated. It was obligation. The methodical breeding program that would characterize the Jessup plantation for the ensuing 10 years began that evening. Within 3 months, Hannah became pregnant. In May 1849, she gave birth to a child. With satisfaction, Isaiah entered the birth in his ledger. He inscribed Jessup Plantation's property next to the entry, gave the child the name Isaac, and calculated the infant's future worth when he grew up. Within 2 weeks of giving birth, Hannah resumed her job in the kitchen. Claudia, an older black lady who had reared many of the enslaved children on the estate, took care of the infant. Thomas carried on with his work. He fathered 4 more children with 3 separate enslaved women over the course of the following 3 years. When Samuel reached 17 in 1850, he started taking part. Daniel started in 1854. It was anticipated that Elizabeth and Margaret, the daughters, would also become parents. However, in this instance, the father would be an enslaved man chosen by Isaiah based on his assessment of suitable physical attributes, such as strength, health, and good clean eyes and teeth. In 1853, Margaret became 18. Ruth prepared her mentally for what was to happen over the course of several months. Margaret did not object. All her life she had been taught that this was commonplace, even expected, and even moral. Jacob, a 25-year-old enslaved man who was employed on the farm as a blacksmith, was delivered on a Saturday evening in November to Margaret's room. Margaret got a baby. In August 1854, she gave birth to a daughter. Margaret was persuaded to keep taking part by Ruth. Margaret had 3 more children over the course of the following 4 years. When Elizabeth turned 18 in 1857, she continued in the same manner. At that time, the system was in good form. The efficiency of the family's operations was cold. Isaiah kept careful notes. Ruth oversaw the births and pregnancies and ran the household. The sons carried out their responsibilities. The daughters had offspring. The slaves had nothing. Voice, no option, no way out. The systematic structure of the Jessup operation, in addition to the forced reproduction, was what made it so unsettling. For Isaiah, it was like farming. To prevent what he referred to as overuse of any one person, he alternated which enslaved ladies were placed with his sons. He kept tabs on menstruation cycles. In order to promote healthy births, he gave pregnant women higher food rations, not out of sympathy. He believed that early separation eliminated emotional ties that could hinder productivity. Thus, he separated mothers from children at the age of 3. The detail of the plantation ledgers from this era that were eventually found and survived is chilling. The mother's name, the date of birth, the child's sex, any noteworthy physical traits, and a predicted future value are all recorded for each birth. Isaiah himself was the father of the children, and he started taking part in them around 1850, when a little comment in the margin, J. Direct Line, indicates that Thomas had demonstrated the system's feasibility. Isaiah thought that these kids would be the most productive if they were preserved, or they would fetch the highest prices if they were sold. The number of people living on the plantation increased from 42 to 68 by 1855. Of those, 26 were under 10-year-olds born as part of the breeding scheme. The Jessup family's fortune significantly grew. Isaiah bought an additional 300 acres to increase his land holdings. To accommodate the expanding population, he constructed a new barn, a cotton gin structure, and more slave quarters. In Wilkinson County, he was regarded as one of the most prosperous planters. The routine of life on the Jessup plantation was harsh. Before daybreak, the field workers got up and went to work. Exhaustedly made their way back to their cottages till nightfall. Despite working somewhat fewer hours, the housekeepers were constantly watched. By the age of 5, children born into slavery on the plantation were assigned to menial tasks like harvesting vegetables, carrying water, and running errands. They were working in the fields or learning trades by the time they were 10. Families were not permitted to genuinely form, although they did grow. Isaiah's early separation policy indicated that moms and children only spent the first 3 years of life together, and even then, the mothers were employed. With a dozen newborns and toddlers under her care at any given time, Claudia, the elder woman who looked after the smallest children, tried her best to offer some maternal comfort. Although Isaiah's ledgers did not document the enslaved people's suffering, the psychological toll on them was severe. Knowing that any woman of childbearing age could be chosen, that any child born would be seized, and that opposition would result in punishment, they lived in continual terror and alert, or demise. Some made an effort to resist. After being forced to give birth to her 3rd child, which Samuel Jessup was the father of, A lady named Sarah made an attempt to flee in 1851. Before being apprehended by a slave patrol, she traveled 17 miles. She was brought back to the plantation, publicly lashed as a form of discipline, and kept for 2 weeks in a tiny storage shed with little access to food or water. She stopped talking after being freed. She worked quietly the remainder of the day of her life, passed away from pneumonia in 1863, and was interred in the Plantation Cemetery's unmarked area. Although all of the Jessup children, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, participated in the system their parents established, their answers differed. The eldest, Thomas, appeared to embrace his position with little apparent emotional struggle. He did business in town, supervised field operations, ran parts of the plantation, and fathered children with women in slavery as instructed. In 1853, he wed Virginia Gentry, a neighboring plantation wife. However, this had no effect on his involvement in the breeding program. Virginia apparently opted not to acknowledge what happened on the Jessup plantation or was unaware of its full scope. As early as 1852, the second son, Samuel, began to exhibit symptoms of discomfort. He started drinking excessively, frequently vanishing for several days. Isaiah disciplined him for skipping work, but Samuel's drinking just got worse. By 1855, he was able to function, but was obviously unhappy, speaking little and avoiding eye contact with both family members and slaves. He was never married. Up until 1858, he remained involved in the breeding program, although his conduct became more unpredictable. Following the birth of her fourth child in 1857, Margaret started to have what Ruth referred to as depressing episodes. In letters to her sister, Margaret would spend days by herself in her room, without eating or talking to anyone. Ruth viewed this as a transient weakness that needed to be disciplined rather than sympathized with. Margaret was not allowed to discontinue her involvement. In 1859, just before the breeding effort started to falter, she gave birth to her sixth child. The youngest, Elizabeth, and Daniel had been so fully assimilated into the system that they appeared to accept it as normal. When it was their turn, they took part without apparent reluctance. Cracks were starting to appear, but this perfect acceptance may have been the most unsettling of all, showing how deeply an immoral practice could be accepted and how totally a person could be shaped by their surroundings. The plantation's enslaved population had surpassed the capacity of its current facilities. The housing was packed, food rations were scarce even though they were plenty by the time's standards. More importantly, the children that the Jessup family had fathered were growing old enough to comprehend who their parents were. Some of these kids were 8 or 9 years old by 1857, old enough to question why they didn't look like other kids in slavery, why their skin was lighter, or why their hair was different. In the seclusion of the quarters after dark, the elder slaves on the plantation softly told them the truth. Even Isaiah's harsh discipline was unable to fully quell the tension and animosity that resulted from this. The enslaved individuals were aware of which family members had which offspring. They were familiar with the system. They detested it. They couldn't stop it, though. And if there was any organized opposition, they would either be sold to plantations farther south where conditions were even worse, or face cruel punishment. Owners of nearby plantations started to take note. Population growth on the Jessup plantations had been abnormally rapid. The demographics were peculiar. There are too many young children compared to grown-ups. Plantation wives discussed Ruth Jessup's daughters and their mysterious pregnancies before marriage in hushed tones. However, this was the antebellum South, where the white planter class's social cohesiveness was preserved by keeping quiet about sensitive subjects. No one would directly challenge the Jessups as long as they behaved well in public, which they did. Isaiah himself didn't seem to care about morality. During this time, he corresponded with other plantation owners about plantation management, cotton prices, political changes, and other business-related topics. Some of these letters have remained in family archives. He only compares his findings to those of cattle breeding when discussing the economic success of his breeding program. He shows no signs of remorse, hesitation, or awareness that he was performing serious evil. He had established a conceptual model whereby slaves were not entirely human, and in that context, what he did was reasonable, even admirable. He was using his resources wisely. He was creating wealth for his family that would last for generations. Ruth's viewpoint was comparable, as evidenced by the few letters she sent to her sister in South Carolina. She was concerned about the future and well-being of her children. However, these concerns were entirely pragmatic. If Samuel's drinking would become a significant issue, whether Thomas would be able to inherit the plantation, and whether the daughters would eventually find suitable marriages. She never voiced concern for the raped enslaved women, the children born into bondage, or the psychological harm being done to all those involved, even though they were part of the breeding program. She believed that slaves were merely property tools and that their misery was unimportant. The Jessup family was hardly the only one to exhibit complete moral blindness. Similar presumptions guided the operations of thousands of plantation owners throughout the South. The Jessups were unique because of their multi-generational planning, methodical family involvement, and calculating coldness. Due to individual owners' exploitation of enslaved women, the majority of forced childbearing on plantations was opportunistic. Jess's program was unique. It was a family business that was meticulous and well-organized. The system that Isaiah and Ruth had established would start to fall apart in 1858 due to changes. Charles Whitfield, the tutor who had taught the Jessup children for over 20 years, passed away unexpectedly in February due to a heart ailment. His age was 57. His passing meant that the family had lost someone who had made their operation possible by remaining silent. Whitfield was aware. Having spent years on the plantation, he had noticed the trend and the increasing proportion of mixed-race children. Outside the plantation, he had never spoken to anyone. His passive collaboration was just as harmful as his active involvement. Isaiah concluded that the younger children no longer required official tutoring after Whitfield's passing. Elizabeth was deemed sufficiently educated at the age of 19. Daniel was already in charge of a sizable chunk of the plantation at the age of 21. Without an outsider residing on the property, the family might continue to function. They became even more isolated as a result of their choice. A 32-year-old enslaved woman named Rose, who had given birth to 5 children as part of the breeding scheme, became gravely ill in April from what was likely tuberculosis, though it was not yet officially recognized as such. She had severe fevers, coughed up blood, and quickly lost weight. Rose was placed in isolation in a little cabin at the far end of the quarters by Ruth, who was worried about the possibility of sickness spreading among the enslaved population. 3 weeks later, Rose passed away by herself without her kids at her side. She was swiftly laid to rest in an unmarked burial. The enslaved community was profoundly impacted by Rose's death. She had sang hymns in the evenings that were audible throughout the quarters, been popular, and discreetly offered consolation to other women compelled to participate in the breeding program. In the view of the Jessup family, her hasty, unmarked, and ceremonial death and burial were signs of her unworthiness. Anger simmered. The cotton crop experienced a blown weevil infection that summer, which severely decreased productivity. Isaiah's earnings decreased. In order to raise money, he had to sell some of the enslaved children who were now old enough to work. He sold 6 children, ages 8 to 12, to a slave dealer in August, who then shipped them to Louisiana. His sons had fathered 4 of the children. Without any formalities, he loaded them onto a wagon early one morning and sent them off, separating them from their moms. The mothers were not allowed to bid farewell. Something in the enslaved community was broken by this incident. Quiet wrath replaced the passive acceptance that had defined the decade before. The slaves started discussing with one another the prospect of escaping. The reports they had heard about the Underground Railroad discusses the growing hostilities over slavery between the North and the South. While the elders warned against it, some of the younger men discussed violence and insurrection. In the communal memory of the South, the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 and its violent suppression were still vivid. To openly rebel was to die. In September, Samuel Jessup's drinking became a catastrophe. One afternoon, after drinking most of a bottle of whiskey, he was discovered comatose in the barn. When he regained consciousness, Isaiah scolded him and threatened to take away his inheritance if the behavior persisted. He also had him taken to the house. Samuel made a hollow pledge to change his ways. He kept drinking at night. He started to completely disregard his plantation responsibilities. Samuel had to relinquish his duties to Thomas. Margaret's mental health declined as well. Margaret attempted suicide in October following the birth of her 5th child, a son she was not allowed to keep and who was taken from her after 3 days and raised by Claudia. Although the exact procedure was never documented, Ruth said in her letter to her sister that Margaret was under strict supervision and had been saved from a hasty decision. Ruth kept Margaret sequestered in her room for 3 weeks. She was thin, hollow-eyed, and pale when she came out. Only when addressed directly did she speak. She walked like a ghost through the house. The Jessup family was starting to show signs of emotional and psychological stress, but they were unable or unwilling to recognize its cause. Isaiah Samuel's drinking was ascribed to a lack of character. Ruth blamed feminine hysteria for Margaret's sadness. Neither linked the terrible system they had established and imposed to the misery of their children. Unquestioned was the basic idea that slaves were property that could be used any way the family saw suitable. A Methodist minister on the road spent the night at the plantation as you crossed the county. From Pennsylvania, he traveled throughout the South to examine conditions and report back to his church. His name was Reverend William Foster. According to Grace, he had dinner with the family and had a courteous chat, but he had detected something. He noticed that the slave quarters had an oddly high proportion of small children, saw the physical resemblances between the Jessup family and some of those kids, noticed Samuel's inebriated gloss and Margaret's haunted expression. The family was not immediately confronted by Reverend Foster. That would have been unsafe and socially unacceptable. However, he took notes in a diary he retained after leaving the plantation the following morning. Those notes made it through. They explain his suspicions, recounted his sense of powerlessness, his anguish at the consequences and what was happening on the Jessup estate. How could he? Being from the North, he had little power in Mississippi. The practice of slavery was lawful. The local authorities would not take any action, even if he informed them of his suspicions. Owners of plantations had near total authority over the slaves they held. They had no repercussions as long as they didn't kill them directly, which was rarely done. One of the few outside evidences that something really unsettling was taking place on the Jessup farm in the 1850s is Reverend Foster's statement, which was included years later in a compilation of testimonies regarding slavery. He said that the enslaved people I saw appeared to live in a state of terror, that beyond the typical fear of punishment, and that the atmosphere was repressive beyond the typical oppression of slavery. December marked the conclusion of the cotton harvest and the arrival of winter weather. Isaiah was under financial strain because of the decreased yield. He studied for many hours, going over accounts and figuring out how to continue to be profitable. Increasing the breeding program's intensity was his answer. He gave Daniel and Thomas instructions to get more involved. He chose 3 more enslaved women that he thought would be appropriate. He established goals, a particular number of births he hoped to accomplish in the upcoming year. As they did every Sunday, the Jessup family went to church in Woodville on Christmas Day, and a significant holiday. They listened to the sermon, sung hymns, and sat in their normal pew. Reverend Donald Patterson, the minister, discussed Christian morality, duty, and family. The Jessups gave a nod of approval. They mingled on the churchyard with other plantation families following the service. Ruth talked about cooking and housework, management alongside other females. Isaiah spoke to other men about politics. The kids were well-behaved, well-dressed, and standing quietly. They seemed like a model family to everyone who looked at them. Isaiah gathered the family in the parlor back at the plantation that afternoon. In the upcoming year, he said, he intends to increase the breeding program. He outlined his expectations for every member of the family. He underlined the significance of productivity, optimizing profits and guaranteeing the plantation's success. He spoke in a serious tone, as though he were talking about equipment upkeep or crop rotation. The kids paid attention. Even Samuel nodded in agreement, even though he was intoxicated. This was the usual for them. All of their lives they had been told this. However, something was changing. Quietly, the slaves in the quarters had started to organize. When plantation slaves were occasionally allowed to attend Sunday church services, a 26-year-old man named Josiah, who was born on the plantation, had been interacting with enslaved individuals on nearby plantations. He obtained information on potential escape routes, empathetic white people who could be of assistance, and the developing tensions between the North and South that could offer opportunity. He cautiously disclosed this information to just those he totally trusted, knowing that everyone may be destroyed by a single informant. The scene was prepared for conflict. The Jessup family thought they had total control. Their system was working just fine and they could go on forever. The slaves were aware of this. They realized that change was on the horizon. whether it was due to escape or the impending political upheaval that everyone could sense. The query wasn't if the system would fail, but if so, how and how much blood would be shed. The meticulous framework that Isaiah Jessup had constructed was destroyed by the events of 1859. The collapse started within the enslaved community itself, not as a result of outside action, fueled by anger and desperation that had grown for over 10 years. When the moon was only a small speck in the sky on a February night, 3 enslaved women, Hannah, Julia, and Rachel, tried their best. 11 years prior, Thomas had been partnered with a woman named Hannah. All 5 of her children had been snatched from her. Samuel's first mother of 4 had been Rachel. Daniel was the father of 3 of Julia's children. The age range of the 3 women was late 20s to early 30s. The 3 had come to a place where it seemed better to die than to live on the Jessup estate any longer. To avoid suspicion, they set out separately, intending to rendezvous 2 miles north at a creek crossing they had scouted on past Sunday treks to the church services at the nearby Plantation. Following the creek north, only going at night, heading near Tennessee, and then possibly heading even farther north was the goal. The little Josiah had learned about contacts and routes had been given to them. At morning roll call, they were found gone after traveling 6 miles. To find them, Isaiah sent Thomas and Daniel right away, along with 2 reliable enslaved trackers and dogs. The scent was promptly detected by the dogs. By early afternoon, the women were discovered sheltering in a ravine. They had no viable means of escape and no firearms. Chains were used to return them to the plantation. Isaiah requested a punished in public. It was mandatory for all slaves on the plantation to observe. The 3 women were tied to posts in the yard between the main house and the quarters and given 10 lashes apiece. Ruth stood on the porch and watched. The kids looked out the windows. The cries reverberated over the fields. Isaiah gave a speech following the whipping. Standing in front of the gathered slaves, he explained that the women had been unappreciative, had refused to accept the favorable treatment they had gotten on his plantation, and had tried to steal because they were robbing themselves, which was theft of his property. He threatened to impose harsher penalties for any subsequent escape attempts. They were lucky to be on the Jessup plantation instead of somewhere with worse conditions, he told them. There was quiet in response to the speech. The slaves stood still, their features meticulously preserved so that nothing could be seen. On the inside, however, the loathing became stronger. After 3 days of being confined to a tiny storage facility with little access to food or water, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia went back to work. For weeks, Hannah's whipping wounds became infected, making it difficult for her to move. Rachel had a fever that persisted for several days. Although Julia was physically alive, her mental state was damaged. Her eyes were no longer bright, yet she worked mechanically and answered when someone talked to her. Samuel Jessup was in his bedroom when he saw the whipping. By that time, he was inebriated, as he was almost every afternoon. Something sparked when he saw the ladies being punished. Women his father's system had made him repeatedly rape. He challenged Isaiah in the study that night. The home was filled with the sound of the quarrel. Samuel charged that his father had been cruel, had established a system of evil, and had destroyed everyone it came into contact with, including his own children. Isaiah answered in icy rage. He told Samuel that he was a letdown, weak and unappreciative. He threatened to cut him off from the family completely if he was unable to carry out his responsibilities as a son. "I would rather be cut off than continue to participate in the breeding program," yelled Samuel. Isaiah hit him. Samuel was knocked to the ground by the blow. Standing over his son, Isaiah threatened to either leave the plantation right away with nothing or to carry on with his tasks. Samuel went out. That evening he left the home, grabbed a horse from the barn, and rode in the direction of Natchez. He never went back to the plantation in Jessup. The family was surprised by Samuel's leaving. Ruth cried, not so much out of sadness as shame. Thomas took on more work to make up for Samuel's absence. Margaret slipped deeper into quiet. Elizabeth and Daniel appeared unconcerned, carrying on with their systemic responsibilities without remark. Isaiah would not mention Samuel and would not allow his name to be mentioned. However, Samuel's encounter had revealed the truth that they all knew but had never accepted. The Jessup family was being destroyed by the system, which was founded on violence and the annihilation of human souls, just as certainly as the enslaved individuals they brutalized. More difficulties came in the spring. A number of enslaved youngsters contracted measles, which swiftly spread throughout the cramped surroundings. 2 kids passed away. Thomas was the father of one of them, Clara Ara, a 4-year-old girl. This was the first time a child who was directly related to the family had passed away on the property. In his ledger, Isaiah recorded the death as a monetary loss. Although Thomas remained silent in public, he was present at the child's burial in the slave cemetery and watched from a distance as the little body was placed into the earth. In April, Margaret became pregnant once more. She was pregnant for the 6th time. Additionally, her mental health had gotten so bad that Ruth started to fear she might not make it through labor. Margaret shivered when someone came near her, hardly ate, and stared out her bedroom window for hours. Ruth attempted a number of remedies and tonics, but to no avail. There was no way out of the nightmare her parents had created for Margaret. Josiah attempted to flee with 4 other enslaved males in May. Compared to the women, they were more prepared. Over several months, they had surreptitiously acquired food, tools, a stolen knife, and other supplies. The White family was asleep when they departed on a Saturday night, and they traveled over 20 meters before being found, absent on Sunday morning. With a larger group, Isaiah dispatched Thomas and Daniel to conduct a search. The hunt took 3 days this time. Because Josiah's gang had dispersed, tracking was more difficult. Ultimately, each of the 5 was apprehended independently and returned. It was a cruel punishment. Isaiah violently whipped them 20 each lash. As the commander, Josiah was given 30. Isaiah then took a risk that he had never taken before. He sold all 5 men to a slave trader right away, and they were taken to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where life expectancy was short and labor conditions were infamously severe. He wished to make it clear that attempting to flee would result in exile to worse circumstances in addition to punishment. The enslaved community was devastated by the selling of Josiah and the others. People had looked to Josiah as a leader and source of hope. There was a gap after his removal. However, it also validated what was already widely known. The Jessup Plantation showed no mercy, no appreciation for their humanity, and no cap on the amount of misery that would be endured in order to keep the system in place. In late July, Margaret went into labor. The birth took a long time and was challenging. Boulaher, an enslaved midwife who had given birth to numerous babies on the plantation, accompanied Ruth to her visit. For hours, Margaret screamed. When the time arrived, the baby was a boy. Margaret grasped. He remained unconscious for maybe 30 seconds. She didn't awaken. She passed away from complications and blood loss 2 hours later. The loss of Margaret affected the family in ways that earlier hardship had not. She was their daughter, a white woman and one of their own. It was impossible to ignore or justify her death. Ruth broke down in tears. Daniel and Thomas stood in stunned silence. Elizabeth shut her room and locked herself in. Isaiah withdrew to his office. 3 days later, the funeral took place. Margaret was laid to rest in the Plantations family cemetery, where she was identified by a good stone. The eulogy from the Presbyterian preacher focused on the comfort of faith and the enigma of God. Families from nearby plantations came and expressed their sympathies. Nobody brought up Margaret's pregnancy or the system that had played a part in her demise. The depravity in Wilkinson County gets worse just when we think we've seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who liked dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please click the like button to show your support for our work. And remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs next. Margaret's baby survived the delivery. Isaiah gave him the name Matthew and sent him, along with all the other offspring from the breeding program, to the quarters to be nurtured by Claudia. The family wanted the youngster out of sight because his presence served as a reminder of Margaret's passing. Something changed in Ruth following Margaret's funeral. Without seeming guilty, she had maintained her husband's restrictions, monitored pregnancies, and actively participated in the breeding operation. However, the death of her daughter caused the psychological barricades she had built to crumble. Quietly, she started to wonder if what they had done was worth the expense. She didn't tell Isaiah about this. She told Elizabeth that she questioned whether God was punishing them, but he would have written it off as weakness brought on by sadness. The youngest daughter, Elizabeth, did not have the same reservations as her mother. She was the Jessup child who had been indoctrinated the most at the age of 20. The world her parents constructed was the only one she had ever known. The passing of Margaret made her unhappy, but she didn't think it had anything to do with the breeding program. Elizabeth saw it simply as the risk that all women faced when giving birth. Without reluctance, she continued to participate. And in September 1859, she became pregnant once more. As Isaiah grew older and more reclusive, Thomas, now 28 years old and successfully running the plantation in his father's place, started to see how unsustainable the arrangement was. Thomas had been too, but not because he had a moral epiphany, largely influenced by his upbringing for that, but based on real-world observations. The population of enslaved people was becoming more antagonistic. The fields had become less productive. There was a tangible sense of fear and resentment. The growing labor force was not being matched by the yields of cotton. There has to be a change. However, Thomas was unsure of the form that a change ought to occur. Although they were unaware of it at the time, the Jessup breeding effort would come to an end in the fall of 1859 due to news from the outside world. In an effort to incite a slave uprising, a man by the name of John Brown launched a raid on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October. The raid was unsuccessful. Brown was apprehended, put to trial, and hung. Nonetheless, the episode rocked the South. Everywhere, plantation owners upped security and patrols and were extremely suspicious of their captive people. In response, Isaiah tightened regulations on the Jessup plantation. Even on Sundays when they went to church under supervision, no enslaved person was allowed to leave the plantation. Curfew in the evening was shifted earlier. There are now 4 white overseers instead of only 2. The fields and quarters are patrolled by men hired from the town. The plantation, which had actually always been a jail, started to feel like one with weapons and whips. However, the bars were now in view, and there were guards everywhere. The enslaved people found life even more intolerable as a result of the greater protection. They were not allowed to meet in groups of more than 5 people without an overseer asking them what they were talking about. Their cabins were randomly inspected for contraband, weapons-making tools, food that could be kept for escape efforts, and anything that would indicate autonomous planning or thought. The severity of the penalties for small violations increased. Robert, a man, was whipped after arguing with an overseer. Due to her tardiness to fieldwork, a woman named Denina spent 2 days detained in the storage shed. An explosion was imminent due to the increasing pressure, and it happened on the Sunday night of December 18, 1859, when the overseers were circling the far end of the property, while the white family was asleep. The cotton gin building caught fire. With the help of dried wood and stored cotton, the fire spread swiftly. The whole building had been swallowed up by the time anyone noticed. The warning was lifted. In a desperate attempt to stop the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings, everyone, white family members, overseers, and slaves, rushed to put out the fire, setting up bucket lines from the well. The main house and the barn were spared, but a large amount of the stored cotton that was awaiting processing was destroyed by fire, as was the cotton gin. It was a tremendous financial loss. What Isaiah discovered when he examined the wreckage the following morning, however, was more important. Proof that the fire was started on purpose. Oil-soaked cloth remnants positioned carefully to do the most harm. Isaiah ordered an inquiry right away. He called a meeting of all the slaves and insisted on knowing who had started the fire. Nobody said anything. He threatening to punish everyone. Quiet. He ordered the overseers to search the apartments for any proof or sign of guilt. There was nothing discovered. Exasperated and furious, Isaiah arbitrarily chose 3 men, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them beaten in front of the gathered slave population, for instance, with 20 lashes apiece. He warned everyone that sanctions would be applied at random until someone confessed. If it came to identifying the guilty party, he would annihilate them all. But since everyone was guilty, nobody came forward to confess. A team of 7 individuals, carefully selected for their reliability and common resolve, had worked together to start the fire. Weeks had been spent planning it and waiting for the ideal time. No one was supposed to be killed by the fire. In order to attack Isaiah's wealth, to cost him money, and to show that they weren't totally helpless, it was set at night when the building was deserted. The fire was a watershed moment. Active sabotage had replaced passive resistance and escape attempts in the enslaved communities. They realized that even if they were unable to liberate themselves, they could still harm their oppressor. Other events happened in the months that followed. The tools vanished. Pigs were able to escape because of damage to a fence that was essential for keeping cattle contained. It was discovered that a quantity of seed corn meant for spring planting was tainted with dirt. Isaiah retaliated by taking harsher and harsher measures, but each punishment simply made the determination and contempt stronger. Although the conflict was mostly hidden from outside onlookers, the plantation had turned into a battlefield. The Jessup property is known to nearby plantation owners as still seemed successful and well-run. Fires were regular on plantations, but they saw the burned cotton gin. The fight that was going on behind the surface was unknown to them. Using pragmatism rather than empathy, Thomas attempted to advise his father to exercise restraint. Slaves were becoming less productive and more dangerous as a result of the severe penalties. Isaiah, however, did not listen. He had been developing his approach for 24 years, and now he would not give it up. The breeding program would go on. There would be control. His will would win out. Ruth, on the other hand, had virtually stopped being involved in plantation management. Something inside Margaret was broken by her death, and it would not mend. Her days were spent in her chamber, where she studied the Bible, prayed, and wrote letters to her sister in South Carolina. Her mind was gradually disintegrating under the burden of guilt that she was unable to ignore. "I fear we have sinned greatly and God's judgment approaches," she said in one letter dated January 1860. "My son is lost to drink and exile. My daughter is dead, and I wake every night to the sound of screams that may be real or perhaps echoes of all the years past." In February 1860, Elizabeth gave birth to her second child, a girl who was just like Margaret. She was expected to return to the breeding program right away, and unlike Margaret, she did not exhibit any signs of psychological distress because she had been too young when the program started and had been too fully assimilated into her parents' worldview to develop the moral conflict that had destroyed her sister and brother. A person so thoroughly indoctrinated that she felt no guilt for participating in systemic rape and enslavement, Elizabeth was in some ways the program's greatest success and its most horrifying product. As winter gave way to spring in 1860, political tensions between the North and South reached a breaking point, and many Southerners saw Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, as an existential threat. Plantation owners throughout Mississippi started talking about secession, bracing for potential conflict. Isaiah was preoccupied with defending slavery in the abstract, the Southern way of life, states' rights, and property rights, while he was oblivious to the specific horrors he had created on his own plantation. He could deliver impassioned speeches about the biblical justification for slavery, the economic necessity of the institution, and the supposed happiness of enslaved people under benevolent masters, while forcing his own children to rape women he owned and separating mothers from babies. Isaiah attended meetings in Woodville, where local leaders discussed how to respond to what they called Northern aggression. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860. South Carolina broke away from the Union in December. Mississippi did the same in January 1861, and by February, 7 Southern states had united to form the Confederate States of America. War was imminent, but few people in early 1861 thought it would be prolonged or involve a significant bloodshed. The cognitive dissonance never seemed to register. During these political upheavals, the Jessup plantation continued to operate, but the impending war created uncertainty. Thomas and Daniel were of military age and would likely be expected to fight. The plantation's workforce might be reduced if enslaved men were impressed into service-building fortifications or working for the Confederate Army. The general belief in Mississippi was that the North would back down, that Southerners' superior military tradition would ensure quick victory, and that the world would not allow the disruption of the cotton supply. In April 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, sparking the Civil War. Within weeks, Thomas joined a Mississippi regiment, followed by Daniel in May. Isaiah, at 53, was too old to serve in the military. This, which had been the focus of family efforts for more than 20 years, suddenly seemed less important than survival in a changing world. He stayed on the plantation with Ruth, Elizabeth, the hired overseers, and the 73 enslaved people, including dozens of children fathered by the Jessup men. With Thomas and Daniel gone, Isaiah and the overseers were left to run the plantation on a day-to-day basis, with the breeding program continuing, but with less organization and intensity as Isaiah grew older and more afflicted with health issues. The war years were chaotic. The Union blockade of southern ports made it difficult to sell cotton. Confederate currency became increasingly worthless. Food supplies were diverted to feed the army. Ruth was hardly functional, spending most of her time in her room. Elizabeth ran the household but lacked the authority and motivation to supervise field operations. Hope started to replace despair as the enslaved people on the Jessup plantation heard stories of Union advances, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines and gaining freedom, of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and of buildings that needed repairs but were never made. Also, fields were planted and harvested, but with less oversight and growing resentment. Isaiah was devastated by the deaths of Thomas Jessup at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, and Daniel, who died of descent in a military camp in Virginia in 1863. His sons, whom he had raised to inherit and carry on his plantation empire, were gone, and his dream of a multi-generational family was dashed. They realized that the world was changing, and that the system that had kept them in bondage was crumbling, so they waited. Ruth died in her sleep in August 1864, buried next to Margaret in the family cemetery. The Jessup plantation was a shadow of its former glory by early 1865. The doctor attributed her death to heart failure, but it might have been better described as the final collapse of a woman who had lived too long with guilt she could acknowledge but not escape. The dynasty built on the breeding program died with them. The plantation buildings were falling apart. The overseers had fled, either to join the army or to escape north. The enslaved people were barely working, waiting for the Union army that everyone knew was coming. And the 67-year-old, in declining health, and increasingly confused Elizabeth, now 26 years old, did what she could. But the situation was out of her control. The fields were half-planted but ill-maintained, and in April 1865, Wilkinson County received word that the Confederate Army had surrendered, ending slavery, the war, and the world the Jessups had created and protected. Union troops arrived in Woodville in May. When an officer arrived at the Jessup plantation to tell Isaiah and Elizabeth that the enslaved people were now free, Isaiah, who was limited to a wheelchair due to a stroke, could hardly understand what he was being told. Elizabeth, however, refused to accept it, arguing with the officer, demanding compensation for the loss and insisting that the people on the plantation were her property. The officer clarified that there would be no compensation, that slavery was in July. Only a small number of the former slaves from the Jessup plantation remained. Unsure of where to go or how to survive in a world they had never known as free people, the former slaves gathered their belongings and left, some leaving the same day they learned of their freedom, while others stayed for weeks, unsure of where to go or how to survive in a world they had never known as free people. Remaining, mainly elderly people with nowhere else to go, Rachel went west toward Vicksburg with her children. Julia, who had never recovered psychologically from the trauma of her years on the plantation, stayed for several months, unable to decide to leave until other people left. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children and walked north until she reached Memphis, Tennessee, where she found work as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. The children fathered by the Jessup men, those who survived to witness freedom, dispersed. Most adopted names different from Jessup, desiring no association with their father's family. Some became farmers working their own land, some moved to cities. At last, freed people persuaded her to accompany them to a Freedmen's Bureau camp where she might receive assistance. Isaiah Jessup died in October 1865 with a listed cause of stroke complications. But more importantly, he died because the world he knew had ended and he was unable to adjust. They went on to become teachers or ministers, carrying the trauma of their origins with them throughout their lives. But they were free. He was buried next to Ruth and Margaret in the family cemetery. Elizabeth was the only one who grieved. She attempted to keep the plantation running when her father passed away, but it was impossible because she had no workers, no money, and no credit. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt following the fire, and the buildings kept decaying. In 1867, she sold a northern investor purchased the property for a fraction of its former value, intending to divide it into smaller farms to be worked by free labor. Elizabeth used the money to move to Mobile, Alabama, where she lived with distant relatives. She never married, she never discussed the plantation or her family in public, and she died in 1891 at the age of 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who had fled the plantation in 1859, survived the war years. Working in Natchez and New Orleans under a false identity, the Jessup Plantation itself was split up into 4 separate farms by 1870, and the main house, stripped of its furnishings and left abandoned, gradually crumbled over the next few decades until by 1900, nothing was left but the foundation. He never stopped drinking, and he died of liver failure in 1872, estranged from his remaining family, leaving no heirs and few possessions. His death went mostly unnoticed. The cotton gin site was plowed under and planted with crops. The slave quarters rotted and collapsed. The family cemetery, overgrown and neglected, became hard to locate. The children born from the breeding program and their descendants dispersed throughout the South and eventually across the nation, and the majority never knew the whole story of their origins. The Jessup ledgers, which detailed the breeding program in great detail, survived by accident, kept in a locked trunk that eventually fell into the hands of a descendant of Ruth's sister in South Carolina. The trauma was too great to describe, and the mothers who survived the program seldom told their children the specifics of their conception. The secret was buried with each generation. The ledgers, along with a few letters, county records, and the oral histories eventually gathered from descendants of enslaved people who survived the Jessup Plantation, provide the evidence for what happened between 1835 and 1865. The story is documented, verifiable, and deeply unsettling. In 1962, that descendant was cleaning out an attic when he found the trunk and the ledgers inside. Shocked by what they revealed, the descendant donated them to a university archive where they were made available to historians studying the realities of slavery. The Jessup case is noteworthy because of the documentation, the icy, detailed records that Isaiah kept treating human reproduction as livestock management, and the psychological impact on everyone involved. Historical research has shown many examples of plantation owners forcing enslaved women into sexual relationships, of systematic breeding programs intended to increase enslaved populations of families, participating in these practices across generations. The Jessup children raised in a system of systemic abuse were themselves irreparably damaged. Thomas and Daniel died young in a war defending the system that had poisoned their souls. The enslaved women who were repeatedly raped, who bore children they were not permitted to raise, who lived in constant fear and degradation, and who endured trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives and was passed down to their children. Ruth and Isaiah, the system's creators, lived long enough to witness its collapse but never admitted the evil they had created. They died thinking they had been good Christians, responsible plantation owners, victims of northern aggression. Margaret died giving birth to her 6th child from the breeding program, and Isaiah drank himself to death in an attempt to absolve himself of his guilt. The most horrifying thing about the Jessup case is how normal they seemed to their peers. Church members who knew them for decades described Isaiah as a devoted family man, Ruth as a devout woman who read scripture every day, and business associates thought Isaiah was trustworthy in his contracts and honest in his dealings, prompting him to pay debts. They also refused to take moral responsibility for the suffering they caused. The horror was concealed in plain sight, shielded by the legal framework of slavery and the social conventions that prevented questions about what happened on a man's property. The enslaved people who survived the Jessup Plantation carried their trauma silently for years after emancipation. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project interviewed former slaves as part of documenting American history, several interviews were conducted with former Jessup Plantation residents, whose testimony, recorded in aging accents but with clear recollections, attested to the presence of the breeding program. One elderly woman, Patience, who was born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, "Mr. He operated that facility as if he were God himself, Jessup. He chose who was born, who survived, and who sold out. His own kids followed his instructions. All of them. To them, we were not persons. We were the crops they were cultivating." The formal evidence in the ledgers is supported by these oral narratives that have been recorded in the Library of Congress archives. The laws of Mississippi and the Confederate States permitted what transpired on the Jessup estate between 1835 and 1865. Maybe that is the fact that is most unsettling of all. Authorities never looked into Isaiah Jessup's case. He was never charged with a crime, and he was never held legally responsible. He had complete control over the people he owned thanks to the system of slavery, and he created a nightmare that persisted for 30 years by using that power. His family voluntarily took part since they were raised to think that their behavior was not only acceptable, but also noble. A display of familial devotion and business savvy. As the system was intended to function, the Jessup breeding program was a form of slavery that reduced people to property, deprived them of agency, used them for financial gain, and destroyed them without repercussions. According to Isaiah's ledgers, the breeding scheme produced at least 47 children. However, the true number may have been greater because some births, especially those that resulted in infant deaths, probably went unrecorded. About 30 of the 47 recorded children made it to the point of independence. Today, there are hundreds of their descendants dispersed throughout the United States, the majority of whom are ignorant of their ancestors' birth conditions or their relationship to the Jessup plantation. In recent years, DNA testing has verified genetic connections between those descended from the Jessup family and those descended from the enslaved population, supplying scientific confirmation of the information previously recorded in historical records. Due to common trauma, some descendants have actively sought one another out, forming racial bonds. Others would rather not know because they find the truth too upsetting to face.